April 1945. A German woman stood at the entrance of an American prisoner of war camp, her uniform torn, her face hollow from months of hunger. An American guard gestured toward a building. Inside, he pointed to a bed with white sheets and a real mattress. She stared. It had to be a trick. The next morning, 500 prisoners refused to wake up. This is what happened. Germany was dying. Not the dramatic, cinematic death you see in movies, but a slow, grinding collapse that turned every day into a test of survival. By the winter of 1944, the war had come home to roost. Allied bombers flew overhead in waves so thick they blocked out the sun. The sound became part of the landscape, a constant drone that made conversation impossible and sleep a fantasy. Cities burned, roads disappeared under rubble, train stations became craters, and the places where soldiers and nurses once slept, the barracks and dormitories that had housed thousands, became holes in the ground or skeletal frames of twisted metal and shattered brick. Helga Schneider was 23 years old when her world ended. She had volunteered as a Helferin, an auxiliary nurse in 1942, back when the propaganda films still promised victory and glory, back when young women lined up outside recruitment offices with flowers in their hair and hope in their eyes. The posters showed smiling nurses holding hands with grateful soldiers. They showed clean hospitals with white walls and orderly rows of beds. They showed a future where Germany would triumph, and everyone who served would be remembered as heroes. By 1945, glory was a frozen memory buried under ash, and survival was the only victory left. Helga worked in a field hospital near the Western Front, a place that used to be a school before the bombs gutted it. The building had been hit 3 times. The first bomb took out the roof. The second collapsed the east wing. The third punched a hole through what remained of the auditorium and left a crater where the stage had been. Now it was just walls and desperation. A shell of a structure held together by sandbags, wooden beams, and the sheer stubbornness of the people inside, who refused to abandon the wounded. The conditions were unspeakable. Helga and the other nurses slept in the basement, a space that had once been used for storage but now served as sleeping quarters for 18 women. The basement flooded every time it rained. Water seeped through cracks in the foundation and pooled on the floor, turning the dirt into a thick, freezing mud that clung to their boots and soaked through their socks. There were no beds, no mattresses, just wooden pallets, rough planks hammered together and laid across stacks of bricks to lift them a few inches off the ground. The pallets were crawling with lice and bed bugs that bit through layers of clothing, leaving red welts that itched until they bled. The women slept fully dressed, coats on, boots laced, gloves if they had them. If you took off your coat, you risked freezing before morning. The basement had no heat. The only warmth came from body heat, and so the women slept pressed together, packed like sardines, sharing what little warmth they could generate. Helga's sleeping spot was in the corner, wedged between Anneliese Koch and the stone wall. Anneliese was 31, 8 years older than Helga, and she had been a nurse since before the war. She had worked in a hospital in Berlin, a real hospital with clean sheets and enough morphine and doctors who had time to wash their hands between patients. Now she worked with whatever she could find, bandaging wounds with strips of old newspaper, stitching up injuries with thread pulled from torn uniforms, administering hope because there was no medicine left to give. Sleep was not rest. It was a battle. Helga would lie on the pallet, her body pressed against Anneliese's back, her own back against the cold stone wall. The bugs would start crawling almost immediately. She could feel them moving in her hair, along her scalp, into her ears. She would scratch automatically, her fingernails digging into her skin, and in the morning there would be blood under her nails and new scabs on her head. The other women were the same. They all scratched in their sleep. They all woke up with blood on their collars. The worst part was that you could never get clean. There was no soap, no hot water. Once a week, if they were lucky, the women were allowed to wash in a stream half a mile from the hospital. The water was so cold it felt like knives against the skin. They would strip down to their underclothes, shivering violently, and scrub themselves with handfuls of sand because there was nothing else. The lice would come back within a day. The bedbugs never left. Food was a memory. The rations had been cut so many times that a meal was now a cruel joke. Breakfast was a cup of ersatz coffee, a bitter brown liquid made from roasted acorns that tasted like dirt and did nothing to wake you up. Lunch was a slice of black bread, dense and heavy, that sat in your stomach like a stone. Dinner was a cup of soup, watery and gray, made from potato peels and whatever scraps the cooks could scavenge. Sometimes there were bits of turnip. Sometimes there was nothing but hot water with a faint flavor of vegetables that might have existed once in better times. Helga's uniform hung loose on her frame. She had lost 20 pounds since the beginning of winter. Her cheekbones jutted out like broken edges. Her wrists were thin enough that she could wrap her thumb and forefinger around them with space to spare. Her collarbone protruded sharply beneath her skin. She stopped looking in mirrors because the reflection was a stranger, a ghost wearing her face, hollow-eyed and gaunt. But the worst part was not the hunger or the bugs or the cold. The worst part was the fear, because everyone knew what was coming. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Soviets were pushing from the east. The front line was collapsing. Every day brought news of another city fallen, another unit destroyed, another retreat. The officers who used to swagger through the hospital barking orders and talking about final victory had stopped visiting. That silence was louder than any bomb. The nurses whispered to each other in the dark. What will happen to us when the Allies arrive? Will they take prisoners? Will they shoot us? The propaganda had been very clear. The Americans were brutal. The British were cruel. The Soviets were monsters. They would rape the women and execute the men. They would burn the hospitals and leave the wounded to die. This was what the radio said. This was what the officers repeated. This was what everyone believed because there was no reason not to. In early April, the order came. Evacuate. The hospital was being abandoned. The patients who could walk were given directions to head west, toward what remained of German-held territory. The ones who could not walk were left behind with a single nurse, an older woman named Frau Dietrich, who volunteered to stay because she was too tired to run anymore. Helga and Annalisa were loaded onto a truck with 30 other women, all of them nurses or communication auxiliaries, and driven toward a collection point near the French border. The truck was a military transport, open-backed, with wooden benches bolted to the sides. The women sat in 2 rows facing each other, their knees almost touching, their bodies swaying with every bump in the road. It was raining, a cold, steady drizzle that soaked through their coats and turned the floor of the truck into a slippery mess. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They were leaving behind the wounded, the dying, the ones who had trusted them to stay. Guilt sat heavy in the truck, heavier than the rain. They drove for hours. The roads were clogged with refugees, columns of people moving west with everything they owned piled onto carts or strapped to their backs. Old men, women with children, families who had left their homes with minutes to spare, grabbing whatever they could carry and running. The truck had to stop repeatedly to let the crowds pass. Helga watched them through the rain, their faces blank with exhaustion, and she wondered where they thought they were going. There was nowhere safe left. The truck stopped in a forest clearing just as the sun was setting. Helga saw the American jeeps first, parked in a neat line along the edge of the trees. The sight of them made her stomach clench. Olive green, clean. The fabric of the canvas covers looked almost new, free of mud and tears. The soldiers standing beside the jeeps wore uniforms that fit properly, helmets that gleamed even in the fading light, and they carried rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They did not look angry. They did not look cruel. They looked calm, professional, bored even. One of them waved the truck forward. The driver, a German corporal who had not said a word the entire trip, shifted into gear and rolled slowly toward the jeeps. He stopped when an American soldier raised his hand. The soldier approached the driver's window and said something in English. The driver responded in broken English, gesturing to the back of the truck. The soldier nodded and walked around to the rear. Annalisa grabbed Helga's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Do not resist, do not speak, they will shoot us." Her voice was a whisper, tight with panic, and Helga could feel her shaking. Helga nodded. She had heard the rumors. Everyone had. The stories whispered in the dark by officers who swore the Americans tortured prisoners, that they lined up captured women and executed them in ditches, that they laughed while they did it. Captain Heinrich Weber, a Luftwaffe officer who had been transferred to their hospital after losing his arm in a fighter crash, had told them this with absolute certainty. He said he had heard it from a reliable source, a fellow officer who had escaped from an American POW camp. He said the Americans were animals. He said they showed no mercy. Helga believed him. Why would he lie? He was an officer. He had no reason to deceive them. And the propaganda on the radio had said the same thing, over and over, until it became a truth that no one questioned. The American soldier lowered the tailgate of the truck. "Get down," he said in German. His accent was terrible, the words clumsy and slow, but understandable. The women climbed down one by one, their hands raised instinctively, their eyes on the ground. Helga's legs were numb from sitting for so long. She stumbled as she hit the ground, catching herself on the edge of the truck. No one helped her. No one hit her either. The soldier gestured toward a spot near the jeeps. "Sit. Wait." The women obeyed, moving as a group, sinking down onto the wet grass. Helga sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her coat soaked through, her teeth chattering. She watched the Americans moving around the clearing, speaking to each other in voices that were calm and unhurried. One of them was smoking a cigarette. Another was drinking from a canteen. They looked like they were on a routine patrol, not guarding a group of enemy prisoners. And then one of them walked over to the group of women and held out a canteen. "Drink," he said in his broken German. The women stared at him. He repeated the word, "Drink." He held the canteen closer, shaking it slightly so they could hear the water sloshing inside. Helga looked at Annalisa, who shook her head sharply. "Do not take it. It is a trick." But Helga was so thirsty. Her mouth was dry, her throat raw. She reached out slowly, her hand trembling, and took the canteen. The soldier nodded and stepped back. Helga unscrewed the cap and sniffed. It smelled like water. Just water. She took a small sip, expecting it to taste bitter or poisoned. It tasted clean, cold. She took another sip and then another, and before she knew it, she was drinking in long, desperate gulps. The soldier did not stop her. He just stood there, waiting. When she finished, she handed the canteen back and he offered it to the next woman. One by one, they all drank. They were held in the clearing for 2 days. The Americans set up tents and distributed more water along with canned rations. Canned meat, canned beans, canned fruit. The women ate slowly, their stomachs unused to real food. Some of them got sick, vomiting into the bushes, their bodies rejecting the sudden influx of protein and fat. But they kept eating. They could not stop. It had been so long. The men were kept in a separate area, fenced off with barbed wire but close enough that Helga could see them. There were hundreds, maybe more, all of them Wehrmacht soldiers who had surrendered in the last few days. They sat in groups talking quietly, eating from the same cans the women had been given. No one was screaming. No one was bleeding. Helga kept waiting for the violence to start, for the executions, for the proof that everything they had been told was true. But it never came. On the 3rd day, the women were loaded onto another truck. This time, they were told they were going to a proper POW camp. Annalisa's hands would not stop shaking. "This is where it happens," she whispered to Helga. "This is where they punish us. They fed us to make us weak, to make us trust them, and now they will kill us." Helga wanted to disagree, but the fear in her chest was too loud. She could not speak. The camp was not what she expected. It was organized, neat. Row after row of barracks painted a dull green, arranged in perfect lines with gravel paths between them. Watchtowers stood at the corners, but the guards in them looked bored, leaning against the railings, smoking cigarettes. The truck stopped in front of a processing building, a low structure with a sign in English and German that read, "Registration." The women were ordered inside. The room smelled like disinfectant, sharp and chemical. There were tables arranged in rows, each one staffed by an American officer with a clipboard. Chairs lined the walls. A few other prisoners sat waiting, men in worn uniforms, their faces blank. One by one, the women were called forward. Helga watched as the woman in front of her approached a table, gave her name, answered questions, and was handed a bundle of clothing. The process took less than 5 minutes. No shouting, no violence, just paperwork. When Helga's turn came, she stood in front of a desk where a young officer sat. He had red hair and freckles, and he looked barely older than her. He asked her name in English. She gave it in German. He wrote it down phonetically, the letters awkward and misspelled. He asked her unit. She told him. He asked her rank. She told him. He nodded, stamped a paper, and handed it to her. "Next," he said, already looking past her to the woman behind. She was handed a bundle by another soldier. A clean uniform, gray, with POW stenciled on the back in black letters. A towel, a bar of soap. Real soap, not the gritty lye mixture they had been using in Germany. She held it to her nose and the smell almost broke her. Lavender. It smelled like lavender. Like the soap her mother used to keep in the linen closet back home before the war, before everything changed. Then came the moment that shattered her. A tall American officer approached. His uniform was crisp, the creases sharp, and his boots were polished to a shine that seemed impossible in a place like this. His name tag read, Donovan, Lieutenant. He spoke in clear, slow English, and another soldier, a younger man with dark hair, translated into German. You will be assigned to Barracks 12. Follow me. I will show you your quarters. Helga followed, her legs numb, her mind blank. Annalisa walked beside her, clutching the bundle of clothes like a lifeline. They crossed the camp, their boots crunching on gravel, past other barracks where prisoners sat outside on benches talking quietly or just staring into space. Some of them looked up as the women passed. No one jeered. No one spat. They just watched with the same hollow exhaustion that Helga felt. Lieutenant Donovan stopped in front of Barracks 12 and opened the door. Ladies, he said, gesturing for them to enter. Helga stepped inside first, and that was when she stopped breathing. The barracks was a long wooden building with rows of beds on either side, maybe 50 in total. And the beds had mattresses, real mattresses, thick and stuffed with cotton, not straw or wood shavings. They had pillows, actual pillows covered in white fabric. They had blankets, thick wool blankets in olive green, folded neatly at the foot of each bed, and on top of each mattress, crisp and white and impossible, were sheets, clean, white sheets, tucked in, smooth, like something from a dream. Helga stood frozen in the doorway. Her brain refused to process what she was seeing. This cannot be real. This is a trick. This is a set. They will take it away. They have to, because beds like this do not exist anymore. They burned. They were destroyed. They are gone. Lieutenant Jack Donovan walked down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. This is yours, he said, stopping beside one of the beds and gesturing to it. The translator repeated the words in German. You will sleep here. There are latrines at the end of the building. Showers are in the building next door. Meals are at 0700, 1200, and 1800 hours. Do you understand? Helga did not respond. She could not. Her eyes were locked on the bed, on the white sheets, on the pillow. Her hands were shaking. Her throat was tight. She wanted to reach out and touch it, to see if it was real, but she was afraid. Afraid that her hand would pass through it like smoke. Afraid that it would disappear. Annalisa was crying. Silent tears streamed down her face as she stared at the bed assigned to her, the one next to Helga's. She turned to Helga, her voice cracking, her words barely audible. They are going to kill us. This is how they do it. They make us comfortable. They give us hope. And then they come for us in the night and kill us. This is psychological torture. This is a test. Lieutenant Donovan frowned. He did not understand German, but he understood the tears. He understood the way the women were staring at the beds like they were looking at ghosts. He said something to the translator, who spoke gently, his voice soft. You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You are safe here. No one will harm you. Helga looked at the translator, then at Lieutenant Donovan, at his clean uniform, at his calm, steady face. She wanted to believe him. Every part of her wanted to believe him. But belief was a luxury she could not afford, not after everything she had been told, not after months of sleeping on cold stone floors with bugs crawling through her hair and hunger gnawing at her stomach, not after a year of being told that the Americans were monsters. That night the women were given dinner, real dinner, boiled potatoes, soft and buttery, carrots, cooked until tender, a piece of bread, white bread, with a pat of butter on the side. Butter, real butter. Helga stared at it, her fork hovering over her tray. She took a small bite of potato. It was warm. It tasted like food, like real food. She ate slowly, waiting for the trick, waiting for someone to rip the tray away and laugh. But no one did. The food was real. The meal was real. After dinner, the women returned to the barracks. They stood around their beds, afraid to touch them. One woman, a communication auxiliary named Ilsa, sat down gingerly on the edge of her mattress and gasped. "It is soft," she whispered. She pressed her hand into the mattress and laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound that was half sob. "It is soft. Oh God, it is soft." Helga sat on her own bed. The mattress gave beneath her weight, cradling her body like something alive. She ran her hand over the white sheet. It was smooth, cool. It smelled like soap. She looked at Annalisa, who was sitting on the edge of her own bed, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress like she was afraid it would vanish. "Do not lie down," Annalisa hissed. "Stay awake. They will come for us when we sleep. I know it. This is the trap." Helga nodded, but exhaustion was a weight she could no longer carry. Her body was shutting down. Every muscle ached. Her eyes burned. Her head felt heavy. She lay back, just for a moment, telling herself she would sit up again in a second. Her head sank into the pillow. The pillow. Soft. Impossibly soft. It cradled her skull like a hand. Her muscles, tight and knotted for months, began to unclench. Her shoulders dropped. Her jaw relaxed. Her eyelids drooped. She tried to fight it. She tried to stay awake. But sleep dragged her under like a tide, powerful and irresistible, and she was gone. All around the barracks, 500 women did the same. They lay down on mattresses with clean sheets and pillows, and they slept. Not the fitful, fearful half-sleep of the war. Not the shivering, aching doze of cold floors and bedbugs. Not the kind of sleep where you wake every hour to the sound of bombs or the itch of lice. Real sleep. Deep. Dreamless. The kind of sleep their bodies had forgotten existed. The kind of sleep that heals. Morning came. The wake-up call sounded at 6. A whistle blew, sharp and shrill, cutting through the dawn. The American guards entered the barracks, boots thudding on the wooden floor, calling out in English and broken German. "Time to wake up. Breakfast in 30 minutes. Up, ladies." No one moved. Sergeant Robert Coleman walked through the barracks, clipboard in hand, ready to take morning attendance. He was a career soldier, 38 years old, who had been running POW camps since 1943. He had processed thousands of prisoners. He knew the routine. Wake-up call at 6. Roll call at 6:15. Breakfast at 7. It was always the same. But today, no one was moving. He stopped at the first bed. The woman lying there, a blonde in her 20s, had not stirred. He called her name, reading it off his clipboard. Becker, Greta, nothing. He moved to the next bed. Meyer, Lotta, no response. He walked faster, checking row after row. Schmidt, Wagner, Fischer, Hoffman. None of them were moving, not a single one. He felt a spike of panic rising in his chest. He rushed to the nearest woman and shook her shoulder. "Wake up, ma'am, wake up." She did not respond. Her head lolled slightly, but her eyes stayed closed. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, strong and steady. She was breathing, her chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. He checked another. Same. They were not unconscious. They were not sick. They were asleep. Coleman ran to find Lieutenant Donovan. Sir, we have a situation. The women in Barracks 12. They will not wake up." Donovan was in the mess hall, drinking coffee and reviewing the day's schedule. He looked up sharply. "What do you mean they will not wake up?" Coleman's face was flushed. "I mean they are asleep. All of them. I tried to wake them. They will not respond." Donovan followed him back into the barracks at a jog. He stopped just inside the door, staring at the rows of sleeping women. Their faces were slack, peaceful. Some of them were snoring softly. One woman had her arm draped over her eyes. Another was curled on her side, hugging the pillow. They looked like children. They looked like people who had not slept in years. Donovan approached Helga's bed. He knelt beside her and spoke quietly, his voice gentle. "Miss Schneider, time to wake up." She did not move. He touched her shoulder lightly. Nothing. He shook her, gently at first, then more firmly. Her eyelids fluttered and she made a small sound, but she did not wake. Her breathing deepened, and she sank back into sleep. One of the other officers, a captain named Morris, came into the barracks. "What the hell is going on?" Coleman gestured helplessly at the rows of beds. "They will not wake up." Morris walked down the aisle, checking faces, shaking shoulders. Same result. Nothing. He turned to Donovan, his expression baffled. Should we call a medic? Are they drugged? Donovan shook his head slowly. They are not drugged. Look at them. He gestured to the women, to their peaceful faces, to the way their bodies were completely relaxed. They are sleeping. Really sleeping. When was the last time they did that? When was the last time any of them slept on a bed? Morris opened his mouth to respond and then closed it. He did not know. None of them knew. Donovan stood up, his face troubled. Let them sleep. Coleman stared at him. Sir? Donovan turned to him, his voice quiet but firm. Let them sleep. No wake-up call, no roll call. When they wake up on their own, feed them. But do not force them. The guards nodded slowly and stepped back. The barracks went silent again except for the soft sound of breathing. Helga woke at noon. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the light streaming through the window. For a long moment she did not remember where she was. She felt warm, comfortable. There was no ache in her back, no stiffness in her neck, no cramping in her legs. Her body felt loose, relaxed. She turned her head and saw Annalisa in the next bed, still asleep, her face smooth and younger than it had looked in months. The lines of worry and fear that had carved themselves into her forehead were gone. Helga sat up slowly, carefully, like she was afraid to break the spell. She looked down at the white sheets, now wrinkled from her body, and the memory came flooding back. The camp, the bed, the American lieutenant, the mattress, the pillow. She had slept. She had really slept. For the first time in over a year, she had slept without waking every hour, without scratching, without shivering, without fear. She looked around the barracks. Other women were starting to stir. Some sat up slowly, blinking like children waking from a long dream. Others remained asleep, their breathing deep and even, their bodies finally getting the rest they had been denied for so long. A guard entered the barracks. It was the translator from before, the young man with dark hair. He saw Helga awake and smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Good afternoon, he said in German. Breakfast was missed, but there is lunch available in the mess hall. Are you hungry? Helga nodded mutely, unable to speak. He gestured toward the door. Come. Bring your friends when they wake. There is no rush, take your time. Helga stood on shaking legs and walked to the mess hall. Inside there were long tables with benches and trays of food laid out on a serving line. Real food, vegetable soup, bread, cheese, apples. She took a tray and filled it, her hands trembling, and sat down at an empty table. She stared at the food for a long moment before she started eating. Around her, other women were doing the same. Some ate slowly, mechanically, like they were still not sure it was real. Others cried as they chewed, tears streaming down their faces, unable to process the kindness. By evening, all 500 women had woken. They gathered in the barracks, sitting on their beds or standing in groups, whispering to each other. They are not going to kill us, one woman said, her voice hushed. They would have done it by now. If they wanted us dead, we would be dead. Another nodded. They gave us beds. They let us sleep. They fed us. Why would they do that if they planned to kill us? Annalisa sat on her bed, her face pale, her hands folded in her lap. I do not understand, she said quietly. None of this makes sense. Everything we were told, everything the officers said, it was all wrong. Helga sat beside her. Maybe, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we were lied to. Maybe everything we believed was a lie. Annalisa looked at her sharply, her eyes wide. What do you mean? Helga gestured around the barracks. This, the beds, the food, the water, the way they treat us. Everything we were told about the Americans, about how they would torture us, how they would kill us. What if it was all lies? What if they lied to keep us afraid, to keep us fighting? Annalisa did not respond. She stared at her hands, and for the first time, the rigid certainty in her face cracked. A tear slid down her cheek and she wiped it away quickly, but more came. She covered her face with her hands and wept, her shoulders shaking. Helga put her arm around her and held her while she cried. Over the next days and weeks, the routine became clear. 3 meals a day, every day, with real food. Work assignments that were light, mostly cleaning the barracks, doing laundry, helping in the kitchen. Medical checkups by American doctors who treated infections. distributed vitamins, and gave out aspirin for headaches. The women gained weight. Their skin cleared. The dark circles under their eyes faded. Their hair, which had been dull and brittle, began to shine again. They began to talk again, to laugh cautiously, to remember what it felt like to be human. Lieutenant Jack Donovan became a familiar figure in the camp. He walked through every morning, checking on the barracks and speaking to the prisoners through translators, making sure the rules were being followed. He was not cruel. He was not warm either. He was fair, professional. He followed the rules, and the rules said prisoners would be treated humanely. Food, shelter, medical care, respect. It was not kindness exactly. It was duty. But to the women who had expected brutality, duty felt like a miracle. One day, Helga was working in the laundry, folding clean towels, when Lieutenant Donovan walked through. She worked up the courage to approach him. The translator stood beside him as she spoke, her voice hesitant. "Sir, may I ask you something?" Donovan turned to her, surprised. "Of course. What is it?" "Why?" she asked. "Why do you treat us like this? We are your enemies. We fought against you. Why do you give us beds and food and kindness?" Donovan looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he spoke, and the translator repeated his words carefully. "Because you are prisoners of war, not criminals, not animals. You fought for your country. We fight for ours. But the war is over for you now. And the Geneva Convention says you deserve to be treated like human beings. That is the rule. We follow the rules." Helga felt something break inside her chest, something hard and cold that she had been carrying for months. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked away before the tears could come. Captain Heinrich Weber, the officer who had warned them about American brutality, was in the men's section of the camp, separated by a fence but visible from certain parts of the compound. Helga saw him once while walking to the mess hall. He was sitting on a bench outside his barracks, his empty sleeve pinned to his jacket, staring at nothing. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished. She stopped walking and stared at him, and for a moment she wanted to scream. "You lied. You told us they would kill us. You made us terrified. And you lied." But she said nothing. What was the point? The lie had already done its damage. Months passed. The war ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7th. The news filtered into the camp slowly, through newspapers and radio broadcasts that the Americans allowed the prisoners to hear. The women sat in the barracks and listened to the reports. The trials beginning in Nuremberg, the camps being liberated, Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The numbers were incomprehensible. Millions, millions dead, murdered, starved, worked to death. The women sat in silence, their faces blank, unable to process what they were hearing. Helga lay in her bed one night staring at the ceiling. She thought about the floor in the bombed-out school basement, the bed bugs, the cold, the hunger. She thought about the white sheets and the soft mattress. She thought about Lieutenant Donovan, who had shown her kindness without asking for anything in return. She thought about the propaganda that had told her he was a monster. And she thought about the camps, the real camps, the ones where people like her, people who followed orders and believed the lies, had sent millions to die. She had been so sure. They had all been so sure. And they had been wrong about everything. The morning after 500 women refused to wake up was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no grand revelations. It was quiet, but it was the beginning of something. A crack in the wall of lies that had held them captive longer than any barbed wire fence ever could. Years later, after the camp was closed, and the prisoners were released and sent home to a Germany that no longer existed, Helga would tell this story to her children. She would sit them down in the small apartment in Hamburg where they lived, and she would describe the basement floor, the bugs, the hunger, the fear, and then she would describe the bed, the white sheets, the pillow. The moment she realized that the enemy she had been taught to fear had treated her with more humanity than her own government ever had. She would tell them that the hardest prison to escape is not made of walls or barbed wire. It is made of lies. And the most dangerous weapon in any war is not a gun or a bomb. It is the lie that tells you the other side is not human. Because once you believe that lie, anything becomes possible. Any cruelty, any atrocity, any horror. You can justify anything if you believe the enemy is not really a person. But if you can break that lie, even for a moment, If you can see the person on the other side as a human being with the same fears and hopes and needs that you have, then maybe, just maybe, there is hope for something better. The beds were not a trick. They were not propaganda. They were a reminder. A reminder that even in the darkest times, even in the middle of a war that destroyed millions of lives, humanity can survive. Rules can be followed. Compassion does not make you weak. Treating your enemy with dignity does not mean you have lost. It means you have refused to become the monster they told you that you were fighting. 500 women slept through the morning because their bodies remembered what their minds had forgotten. That rest is a human right. That dignity is not a reward to be earned. That kindness is not a weakness. That even in war there are lines that should not be crossed. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show mercy when no one expects it. And sometimes that choice changes everything. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history that reveal the humanity hidden in the darkest moments. Hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What would you have felt waking up in that bed after months of suffering? Let us know below.